Welcome to the Green Medicine Podcast. In today's episode, I talk with environmental artist Jill Chism about how art can contribute to our well-being. How can art impact our understanding of the necessity of a relationship with the natural environment? From an artist's perspective, I talk to Jill about how she understands green medicine. In this interview, we explore the notion of oneness and interconnectedness and how that can be expressed through an art practice. Jill develops her artworks through feeling and deep observation rather than conceptually as a complete reversal from earlier approaches. She is not interested in having a signature style, as her approach is to be open and receptive to what she finds. Jill is working towards a solo exhibition in Gallery 1 at NORTHSITE Contemporary Arts in Cairns in August 2024, titled Remnants. Welcome, Jill, and thanks for joining us today on the Green Medicine program.
My pleasure, Barbara.
Jill, you've got an extensive background in the arts, including environmental arts. So when did you first get interested in using art as a medium to talk about the environment?
Well, it's, I've always, as a child, I think I've always been really interested in environment. I've spent a lot of time in the bush, like every Australian child, and a lot of time at the beach. And I think later in life I actually owned a yacht and I sailed the Whitsunday. So I've always had this sense of expansiveness, a sense of space. And when I finished my master's in Wollongong in 1992, I felt this I felt very drawn, if you like, to installation art, because installation art explores, art in terms of space. There's a kind of sense, there's a term site-specific art practice, which actually brings the site into the creation of the work. So it could be the gallery site. So you almost comment on the gallery site. But from my perspective, I was much more interested in looking at sites that were in the environment. So I think it was 1993, I actually did an installation at a place called the Pool of Peace, which is on Stanwell Tops in New South Wales. And it actually sits at the top of the escarpment. And it had a really interesting story. And I think this is where my interaction with environment kind of really took place, because I think what I understood, I did some research about the Pool of Peace and understood it had both an indigenous story, which was really interesting, but also it kind of was compounded by the fact that it was a suburb, lots had been divided up. So there was this Western concept of dividing space and structuring space, and yet there was this love story about two indigenous people from neighbouring tribes and how that was not allowed, if you like. And so what happened was they were killed and they were thrown into the pool. So the legend is that the red colour that's in the pool that goes, turns into a waterfall that goes over the escarpment is actually the blood of these two lovers from these neighbouring tribes. So I think at that stage I was thinking about how, these stories kind of don't really match, because there's this sense of claiming land, a sense of ownership, and yet there's this sense of a kind of narrative about land. So that was the beginning of thinking about the different ways in which we perceive environment. And then I think later on, I moved up to Cairns. After I did that Pool of Peace installation, I moved up to Cairns in, I think, 1994, and there was a really burgeoning art scene at that time. There was Kick Arts had started the year before. I immediately became a member because I was interested in cutting-edge art practice, and there was a lot of, electricity in the air about new art practices. So I got involved with Kick Arts and was in many of the shows that were curated by the members and visiting curators. And I think my next engagement, because we're talking about land and how artists work with land, how artists work with environment, and was when in 1996, Russell Millage had a project called Uncharted the River, and he asked artists who were living in the, like I was living at Machin's Beach at the time, to engage somehow with the river. How do you chart the river? How do you create work that's about a river? And so one of the things I did, because I had that yachting background and I'd kind of learnt how to do running fixes and chart my course, if you like, I started charting some of the objects that were found on the edge of the river. So, and I felt that was a way of actually, at that stage, of making us look at what's happening in that culture, in that environment. So there were old tractors that were kind of pouring into the river, and there was bits of concrete, and there was human detritus and things like that. So I started putting marks around those. There was actually a big house that looked like it was falling into the river at Rankin Sawmill. So I even put a big running fix around that house and got an aerial shot of it. So, in some ways, I think what I was doing was taking art back to the landscape and probably picking up a bit where land art took off in America in the 1960s.
Yeah, I was aware of land art, and I was going to ask you, well, what is the basic difference then between land art and environmental art?
Well, what happened in the 60s, there was like the American artists wanted to really stand out and become, important in the world scene, if you like, the global scene. So they started doing work where they were making marks on the earth, using the earth in a way as their canvas. So you'd find graders going out and digging holes, like a jagged line across a desert like the Nevada desert, and then they'd fill it with coal. Or in the case of Robert Smithson, he made a spiral jetty, for example, in Lake Utah. I think the thing that was really interesting, and people looking at land art will know this, is that these artists were making marks on the land, but there was no sense of an environmental angle on it. So, there was thousands of truckloads of dirt that were poured into this lake. And of course, later on there was an algae that was growing between the spirals, and still an amazing landmark, because, there's a sort of almost a sense of the cosmos, people looking down from the cosmos and looking at the landscape in a completely different way. But, they did things like they tipped bitumen down a hill so they can make lines in the earth on a hill. So that was, for environmental artists today, an absolute anathema, because we're on the brink, we're in the tipping point at the moment. And I think, there's a lot of art around the world that's kind of making, using art as a way to kind of make meaningful statements about some of these huge issues, global issues that we're facing at the moment. At that stage, I think, when I was doing that earlier work, I didn't really have a sense of, how huge an impact that these kind of environmental disasters were having.
And so I know that you were also at that time engaged in doing the Great Walks. Can you talk about that, the development of that?
Yes, I think that was a bit of a turning point for me. So what happened was the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, opened up a series of walks along the Queensland coast, and they engaged an artist in certain areas along the Queensland coast to comment on that walk. So it was like such an amazing project, because for me, again, it took me out into the environment. And I think what I did, I was actually the only artist who was engaged in this project to actually walk the walk, because I felt that, the only way you're going to actually understand what's going on in a walk is to actually engage in the walk. And it was a 50-kilometre walk. There was a lot of things that went wrong because they hadn't finished the walk. But one of the things that I noticed is that in walking, there's a sense of where you lose yourself. When you're in the environment, and there's a sense where you lose yourself, you lose who you are. There's no sense of identification anymore. You can't say, I'm Jill, the famous artist, I'm something. You're actually just engaging in your moment by moment, I suppose, experience.
So is it an opportunity in a way to drop this whole identity of who we think we are as well, when we're immersed in nature and,
Yes, and I think, it kind of, I wrote a poem called Marking Time, and it was about that, losing that sense of baggage about who you are, and then there's a sort of openness, a sense of connection that opens up. You have a sense of, there's an immediacy and there's an openness, And I think that was the first time that I really, explored something a little bit different in this, if you like, environmental art practice that was emerging.
Because you talk quite a bit too in some of your work about oneness, and so is that something that's started to come out of, your art practice from immersing yourself in nature?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think oneness, I realise that we, often talk about oneness, and it's fairly conceptual. Most people don't really understand oneness, because I think oneness is a complete, where you completely lose yourself. And I think art, any sort of art, writing, there's an opportunity to lose yourself in an environment by doing deep listening. I know you use that term in green medicine, or Aboriginal. You got that from an Aboriginal person.
Dajara, which means deep listening.
That's right.
Which is really, a profound connection with the country that you're in.
Yes.
And a loss of self and, an immersion with the country.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that writers and artists use the right side of their brain. This is the other thing that's interesting. The left side of the brain, as we know from neuroanatomists, like Jill Taylor, for example, who discovered this when she had a
stroke.
Yeah, she had a stroke. And so basically she was only operating from the right side of her brain, and all she felt was connection. She couldn't actually do anything. She couldn't add up. She couldn't even name herself.
She couldn't talk
or
anything.
She couldn't talk, that's right. So it's kind of interesting that art and writing and, the arts have the opportunity to access that side of the brain, and I think there's a lot more that we understand about that side of the brain now. And I think this is part of the brain that you use when you really want to understand or feel or even engage intuitively with environment. I actually did a project in 2007 where it's actually following the Great Walks project, where Arts Queensland gave me a fellowship. It was fabulous, because I did 4 years where I just engaged at different water locations on the Queensland coast with different galleries and different groups of artists. And we went out and actually went to sites, and I think at that stage I was much more aware of that deep listening that we just talked about, not just going there and just, imposing an idea on a site, but actually...
What was the name of that project?
That was called Water's Edge.
Water's Edge.
Creating environments.
Yes.
I went to 5 different regions, and all the different artists had kind of different ideas about the site and what they wanted to bring to it, and maybe, the part that humans had played. And I think the other thing that started emerging, not only were we kind of listening and looking at what was going on at the site and creating work in response to that, we're also aware of the issues that were starting to become more dominant and more evident. Things like we went to Broken River in Mackay, and there were high levels of E. coli in the water, to the point where, it was threatening the platypus population. There were a lot of dairy farms around, so there were even signs up at Broken River saying, don't swim in the water. So artists started making E. coli, things that looked a bit like E. coli, and sort of layering them out in the water. And I made a work, I remember at that point, where I just got these glass mirrors and made them float. And I actually had a chant. What was it? Pure, clean, flowing
water
source, thank you. Pure, clean, flowing source, thank you. And I actually it was a bit hippie-like. We got sort of a group of people and we all chanted that to the river as a way of, thinking even about people like Matsuru Emoto, who actually did a lot of work on rivers and water and lakes, where he was able to change what was happening in the streams or the water by actually chanting. I'm sure you're aware of that, where he used to...
I am. But what you're talking about, it's not that far-fetched when you think about now. We're actually giving rivers legal